In this episode, Tom Fox and Megan Dougherty near the end of their exploration of the WandaVision television series with episode 8, Previously On. And as promised, here is Megan Dougherty. Welcome back, Megan.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Megan, we are here for episode 8, the penultimate episode, entitled Previously On, end quote. Lots of deliciousness in this episode. What are maybe some of the bigger themes you saw or struck you in your rewatching of this?
This is the episode where you learn a lot. After last episode's reveal after reveal, now we're getting a little explanation, a little more context for everything that went on, starting with, I'm going to go out and say it, fan favorite, Agatha the Witch, and her origin story, presumably back in Salem, being held to account by her coven and her mother, defeating them soundly by means not quite explained. In the last episode, we talked about not really understanding Agnes's/Agatha's motivations. I don't think it's necessarily any clearer now that we've seen her go through all of this process. But after that little bit of backstory, we are back in her dungeon, her delightful dungeon, where she is starting to give Wanda some of the therapy she has badly needed for at least a decade. Doing a little bit of that inner work a little bit too late to actually be useful and for nefarious intent. But we got to see the different parts of Wanda's past, all these different traumas that she underwent, and how they all combined into, the mental or psychotic break that resulted in her creating a hexagram in an alternate reality around the citizens of West. What were your takeaways? What are some of the things you noticed?
The origin scene of Salem 1639 was a lot of fun. And it was a lot of fun because it was evil. It was the coven. It was her mother trying to destroy her. And her mother ain't a great character, or ain't exactly a nice lady either.
Well, I don't know if we know that. Because I think she had broken rules. She had broken laws.
She'd broken the coven's laws.
Yeah.
So what? I mean, she's a witch. She can do anything she wants.
In-groups have laws.
But the way she defeated them, though, was they were going to impose their mental will on her and destroy her as she's tied at the stake, and she overpowers all of them mentally. This is not a physical challenge. This was mental. And it struck me that Agnes/Agatha is an incredibly powerful being. I thought that power wasn't fully realized in the rest of this episode or the next because, spoiler alert, she loses. But I saw incredible power from her in the way she defeated her mother and the coven.
I thought that was interesting because other than desire for power and to accumulate more of it and to take it from those who don't deserve it, she doesn't seem to have much motivation other than just the pure lust for power. And I think that's fun because you don't often get to see that as a woman character's motivation. It's just the blatant acquisition and wielding of power for power's sake. So I thought that was...
The next thing I had down was at one point in Agatha's house in the dungeon. Oh, and let me talk about the dungeon.
Let's talk about the dungeon.
Let's talk about the dungeon. I keep saying in Agatha's house, but I think the dungeon is somewhere else. I think we have left Westview somehow. And it really didn't strike me until I rewatched it that we have entered another dimensional plane here. I'm not quite sure how we got there, but that was one more part of Agatha's power that really impressed me. But at one point, Wanda responds essentially saying, "Leave my children alone," when Agatha threatens the boys. And when she says it, she slips back into a Slovakian or Slovovian accent. She's going back in time, and she's going back to her roots, all the while growing in power and in the range of what she can do, as we find out at the end of this episode, is the Scarlet Witch. So that part I thought was pretty cool, and it really struck me. There was one part that was perhaps the most geek scene in the entire 9-part series. It lasted somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds. And it's when she's looking for a DVD and she pulls a drawer open, and it's all of the sitcoms we've been referencing throughout this entire series. And I just thought that, I don't know what the name of that person is in the TV production set who the prop master. That was just brilliant. And in researching for this podcast, I came across articles that analyzed just that 3 to 5 seconds. And then they went through and they actually went to the episodes referenced on the DVD cover. So it was just fabulous.
I love that scene where that happened, and that's where we got to meet young Wanda and Pietro and their parents, and obviously what happened to them. So that the idea of using these television shows to practice their English and have the nice family time amidst a country, a city, a street descending into chaos I thought that was really moving. And of course, then the bomb strikes, the missile hits, and I thought that was hard to watch. And just knowing that happens to families every day that hit me really hard.
So I found the scene where she goes for the first time to Westview really moving. And go ahead.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but also the new version of the taking of Vision's body scene, putting forward the idea that she hadn't actually done it and that video original was a plant. What did you think of that?
The first time I saw that scene, I thought it made sense to me. The first scene, not in this episode. When I found out it was a plant, though, I was confused. It certainly made me see those guys in a very different light, and almost an evil light. But it ties into something I'm going to flip to at the end of this episode, which is, I'll just say it now then. Wanda's powers are called chaos magic, and Agatha tells her, or names that. I just don't see this as magic because of the experimentation or laboratory testing that was done on her back in Slovenia, and the work done by her on Hydra, particularly with the Mind Stone. I have always seen her as, I don't want to say mutant, but an enhanced human with enhanced powers, and not really as a witch using magic. And
I'm gonna respond to that, I think, with a callback to
okay.
We're going back to Thor for this one. Because you remember learning about Asgard and how these beings were considered deities by the people of Earth, when really all they just had was much, much fancier technology. And I think they even said, I can't remember in which movie, but at a certain point, sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Depending on the viewer and who you're seeing it, there's no meaningful difference between super advanced technology and magic. So I think on that basis, maybe it is a super advanced or super as of yet unexplained physical phenomena that has given Wanda her powers, but I don't think it's any less magic than what a human would have considered the Bifrost to be.
An Asgardian to be. No. Let's get back to the house.
Okay, back to the house, because that is a scene.
Okay, she goes to Westview. She doesn't go to a house. She goes to the location of a lot that Vision has purchased, where he hopes to build their family, a home, and they live together with the husband and white picket fence. And it's a vacant lot. And on the deed, the property deed is a heart. And if you think back to episode 1, when we saw the calendar and they were trying to figure out what the heart was for. In episode 8, she's on her knees and she is overcome with the largest amount of grief I saw her with in this entire series. And at that point, she creates the construct of Westview. And she does that, and that's why it really made sense to me that you've been talking about grief, and you've been talking about working through grief and the arc or the cycle of it. And in that scene, for me, it encapsulated how did all this begin, the true origin of Westview. And it was not unrecognized grief, but grief so deep that she could put no meaning on it other than to create something to hide. And so I found that perhaps as powerful a scene I have seen in any episode to date, and that it really showed her journey through grief, how we started, where we are now, and where we may be going. But it was just, and what would you say this scene is? 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds? It's just not, yeah. And I just thought it was fabulous.
I completely agree, and I love how it echoed just her kind of losing that willful control of her powers to the moment in Age of Ultron when Pietro was killed and she found out. And she also, it was the same thing. She fell to her knees and her power exploded out of her and killed all of those robots that were around. I thought it was interesting how they mirrored that, this kind of outpouring of power without the control. It was just her emotions were expressing themselves as her magic.
And up until I had really watched this series and visited with you, I thought that was rage. I had never considered a response that we've seen in Wanda to grief, but it really drove home to me that you can have uncontrolled grief. It can direct your mind to different places it didn't expect to go. It has never been. And so I thought that in that one scene, it encapsulated all of that for me.
It's a hell of a drug. And she experienced it again and again throughout her life.
Right.
Every time she had something, it was taken away in the most brutal fashion. Her parents, maybe you can call it her childhood or her innocence when she was radicalized by Hydra. Her brother, then the team, then the world, then Vision. And they wouldn't even give her a body to bury. Oh,
right. What about Vision in this episode?
Again, just was not paying a lot of attention to Vision in this one. Yeah, I was paying more attention to the development of White Vision. Because in the final episode, which we'll be talking about soon, it gets really interesting again. But it was not. It was all about Wanda for me, and Agnes.
So I really like the way they set up White Vision for episode 9 in episode 8, because in episode 8 I just thought he was a killing machine, and he was sent specifically to kill Wanda's Vision, and that may change in episode 9. I don't want to give too much away, and you could easily see how Wanda's Vision could have been the White Vision, but he wasn't, whether that was Tony Stark or Jarvis, some combination of that. I really like the way they set up the White Vision, and anytime I have dialogues in my head with myself all the time.
Don't we all?
Just because I'm sober doesn't mean I'm well. And so I'd love to see that play out. I guess we could say inner monologue, the literary term. I think we're set up for a great final episode. Any final thoughts, Megan?
I guess just to note, because it was in this episode, I think it was just really interesting how this sort of unrepentant villain in the form of Agatha Agnes was really, I think, genuinely and materially helping Wanda start to process the things that had happened, and giving her the awareness and the development and the interior tools to be able to do what happens in the next episode. So for a bad guy, I think she might have done kind of a bad job of being bad in that sense. I think her motivations were terrible, but I think the outcome was ultimately quite useful.
Well, that's a really interesting point, because we talked about in episode 7, Monica and her attempts to reach Wanda, and those attempts didn't work. And you're absolutely right. Agnes/Agatha keeps pushing Wanda, pushing her and pushing her. Her motives may be so that she finally, in full flower, reveals herself as the Scarlet Witch, and then perhaps Agatha can learn or steal her powers. So perhaps there is a nefarious intent, but it may be that Wanda's grief was so deep that it took literally being pushed to the edge of losing everything from Agnes/Agatha to get her to work through that or process it. So maybe Agatha's necessary for Wanda's mental health.
I think so. I think I've said since the first episode of this season that this poor woman needed like a decade of therapy immediately. And Agnes gave her a crash course. I don't think it would be recommended by anyone. What she did is going through, look at these events, face what happened, feel your feelings about them. From what I understand about current therapeutic practice, that's not far off the ball in terms of what actually needs to happen. You wouldn't use Agnes's methods. It worked.
Well, that would seem like a good place to end episode 8. So I am Tom Fox.
I'm Megan Dougherty, and we will see you next time for the very last episode of WandaVision.
As Megan noted, our next episode will be the final version of WandaVision in episode 9, entitled The Series Finale. Because That's What Heroes Do is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.